Hello and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman. Today we are at week 28 of our Scrappy Block series. It's hard to imagine that we're already over halfway through the 52-week series. And each of the Scrappy Blocks that I have been creating for you are the 12.5-inch size so that you can use them together in quilts. You can certainly make these squares or these Scrappy Blocks in any size that you choose, depending on what you have in your scrap stash. I had been asked whether or not I'll be putting together a book of all of these 52-week Scrappy patterns and photos, and yes, I will be doing that. That will come this summer once we're through with the 52-week series, and I'll have that together in a booklet. I'll put that out on my website so that you can see that. But be aware that every week when I do post a new video, I do have the PDF for that block linked in the description box. So make sure that you download, save that PDF, and make sure that you create a playlist or save my playlist, whatever works best for you, of all of the Scrappy Blocks so that you have all of it and you can refer back to it whenever you need to. And you can also refer, in fact, I make note in the PDF today to see the video as you're going through the instructions. And for me, it's always easier not only to read the instructions, but also to see somebody putting it together. That helps me. And for those of you who do not have a scrap stash ready to go, I'd like to encourage you to watch my video, and I'll have a link below here. It's my Speedy Solutions to Cut and Organize Your Scrap Stash. It will teach you everything you need to know to cut, sort, organize, and store, and then of course use your scrap stash. There's 5 patterns in here as well as the techniques, and there are an additional 12 patterns in this one. So this is a great book set. You can find this out on my website. I will link that below in the description box. So with each of the squares that I've been presenting for the last 28 weeks, I do present them so that they will make a 12.5-inch unfinished block. And today's block is, I'm calling it Crossing the Lines. Really fun one to make. And I went through my stash. I have a lot of 6.5-inch squares and 1.5-inch strips, and I wanted to use them. And I encourage you to do that whenever you're looking through your stash. See what you have a lot of, and then create a block or find a block that uses those sizes so that you can use up your scrap stash to make some beautiful quilts. So that's what I've done. I pulled 6.5-inch squares and I've pulled 1.5-inch strips of fabric to make these blocks. So let's see how this is done. Don't forget there is a PDF that is attached in the description box below. So let's take a peek at what I have here and what I have pulled. So this is today's block, and I've called it Crossing the Lines, and it's simply 6.5-inch squares with 1.5-inch strips. What I have done here is I have pulled 4 different, in this case, sort of a light to medium value in a blue. And hopefully you can see that I've got 4 different squares. I cut them on the diagonal, and you'll see that as I go through the instructions once, and then I'm sewing these 1.5-inch strips in between the 2 triangle sections that I have cut apart. And then we are placing a 6-inch strip between these 2 pieces, and then a 12.5-inch strip here. And that's how the block goes together. And then of course what I have done is pressed all the seams toward the dark. And in the case of this block, the dark is the strip itself. You may choose squares that are dark and strips that are light. And then when you press, you're going to be pressing just the opposite of what I have done here. But that's totally up to you. And some people, in fact, I'm seeing more and more quilters who are choosing to press all of their seams open. And that's a wonderful option for you. Just make sure that your stitch length is a shorter stitch length so that you're not seeing the seams pull out when it's being used and when it's being quilted. So this is the block. I love it. I like it. The scrappier the better. In fact, I use blues here, these light to medium blues. You certainly don't have to use matchy scraps. You can use, here are 4 different squares that I'm going to use for the sample block. And I have this dark brown strip that I'm going to be using to piece this all together. So the first thing we're going to do with all of these 6.5-inch squares, and you need 4 squares per block, is simply cut it on the diagonal. And then I'm going to take it to the iron and I'm going to press a crease in there, and I'm going to press my 64-inch length. In fact, I've got a couple of links here of some strips, and these were strips, 1.5-inch strips that have been used in something else, and as you can see, it's been pulled apart. I don't even remember what it was that they had been in. They're kind of hairy on the outside, which means, you know, they've been in a project and then removed. But I'm going to use these for this particular block. I think what would be fun is to create each and every block different, so so it's a really scrappy one. If you don't like that look, if you want it to be a little bit more uniform, you could go through and make sure that all of your 1.5-inch strips were identical for the entire quilt. There's a variety of things you could do, or maybe your 4 squares could all be identical, and then maybe you're using a similar value of the strips in each one. There's so much you can do. Look through your scrap stash, see what you have and what you can do to make this fun block. So the first thing I'm going to do with my 4 6.5-inch squares is simply cut them on the diagonal. All right, so now I have 4 different squares. Let me see if I can get them pulled apart here so you can see them. All right, there we go. So there's my 4 different squares. Now I have a total of 8 triangles. And what I'm going to do is take this to the ironing board, and I'm going to press a crease in each one of these triangles right there, so that when I sew my strip on that, I'm going to have a crease in the strip as well as in the triangle, and that will be the matching point, so everything goes together nicely. So make sure that before you go to the sewing machine, you definitely press a crease. You can either do it by your hand or take it to the machine or to the iron and press it. So that has to be done, and then you need a total of 64 inches of the 1.5-inch strips per block, and what you're going to need is a total of 4 10-inch strips. So let me just go ahead and cut that here. Here are 2 of them. All right, and I need a couple more here. And these 10-inch strips are actually going to be trimmed away. You'll see that once we get into the piecing of this. And then we need 2 6-inch, and that is so close, but not quite. So I need 2 6-inch strips. And again, I am using leftover remnants. Whenever you can, use leftover remnants. Absolutely do that from your scrap stash. It's a great way to use up your scrap. So there's 2 6-inch, and then I need 1 12.5-inch. Oh, I got 12, but not 12.5, so let's go to this one right here. All right, I'm going to move it back here so that you can see a little better here. Okay, there's 10, 11, 12, and a half right here. Okay, so I have all the parts and pieces that I need, and then I'm also going to take these 10-inch strips of fabric to the iron, and I'm going to make sure that I have a nice crease pressed in all of those. That crease is what we are going to match up with the crease on the triangle. So make sure that's done as well. So now I'm going to make sure the pressing of the creases is nice and firm on the iron, and I'll meet you at the sewing machine. So here I have the block laid out, and again I am using 4 different 6.5-inch squares, and as you can see I've kind of laid them opposite one another, and I have my 10-inch strips right in the center of each of these, and I've got my creases in not only the 10-inch strips but also in all of these triangles, so I have a matching point when I sew this together. So I'm just going to start up here in this corner, and I'm going to match the crease on the triangle with the crease on the strip, right sides together. And I am just going to place it on my sewing machine and stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now let me see if I can get this so you can see a little bit of what I'm doing here. So I'm simply just sewing down the seam here at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you'll see here that the triangle is centered on the strip. So there are edges that are coming off both sides, and that's important. You need those edges coming off, and you'll see it here in a little bit when we trim this. So now we've got one of these done. Now I need to take the other one and make a complete square. I'm again matching the crease with the triangle and the crease and the strip, as you can see here. And I'm going to lay it on the machine. So a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, you'll see that the stripe or the strip, the 1.5 inch strip, is centered there between the two triangles. And we'll be taking this to the iron here shortly. And since my dark is the strip, when I go back to press, I'm going to be pressing everything toward the center, toward the strip. If your outsides were darker, then you press your seam allowances out. But in my case, I'm going to press all of my seam allowances toward this dark brown for this particular block. All right, so then we're going to lay it back in here, and we're going to do the same with all 4 sections here, pressing the triangle, or stitching the triangles to the strips, matching all of these creases so that they're stitched on there properly, and then we're going to do the pressing. Let me accomplish that, and I'll be right back. So for this block, what we're going to be doing is trimming each of these squares to 6 inches. And then when we add our 1.5 inch strip here and our 1.5 inch strip there, we'll end up with a block that's 12.5 inches unfinished. And that's the goal for this Scrappy series. All of the blocks are 12.5 inches, so you can use them together if you wanted. Now, again, you can make this block any size you want, depending on what kind of scraps you have in your stash. Doesn't have to be this size. It can be smaller. Maybe you have 5 inch squares and 1.5 inch strips. Certainly go ahead and do that. Have fun with it and enjoy using up your scraps to make beautiful blocks. But what we're going to do is trim each of these squares to 6 inches, and I'll show you how we're going to do that. Before we do any trimming, I wanted you to see that I have taken each of these to the iron, and I have pressed a crease lengthwise down the center of that strip. So basically, when I laid it on this ironing board, I made sure that I was lining up the seam allowances here, and then I pressed a nice sharp crease there. That crease is a line that I'm going to need as I trim these to 6.5. So I've done that in all of these. I've pressed a crease down the center of that strip. Now we're going to show you how I'm going to trim these up to 6 inches. They're going to each become a 6 inch square. So there's a diagonal line here in the center of my ruler, which I am matching up to that crease in that strip. That's very important. Get it as close as you can. And then center this ruler on this 6.5 inch square as closely as possible, and then trim around. And so I'm just eyeballing it and centering it, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the excess here. And this is a 6 inch ruler. I also have a 6.5 inch ruler, but this one is a 6 inch ruler. Let me flip it around here. Again, I'm lining up these sides because they've already been cut, and the diagonal line is going down the center. All right, now each of my squares is a perfect 6-inch square, and it's got the strip in the center. It has a nice square on each end. So I'm going to do that to all 4 of these. I'll get that done and I'll be right back. All right, so I have my 4 squares trimmed up to 6 inches. I have them laid out. It's kind of looking like a bit of a pinwheel here as well. But now I've got my 6-inch strip here, my 6-inch strip here, and then the 12.5-inch strip is going to go here. The first thing I'm going to do is sew this 6-inch strip between these two and this one between these two. And then once that's done with the seams pressed to the dark, then I will sew the 12.5-inch strip in between the top and the bottom section. And the block is then ready to be pressed and squared up to 12.5 inches. Let me get these sewn and I'll be right back to the tabletop. So I have the top section and the bottom section. I guess as you're looking at that, this is the top and this is the bottom, but I have them ready. And now I'm going to put the 12.5-inch piece together with sewn in the center of this. What I'm going to do, since this piece I know is 12.5 inches, I want to make sure that this section and the bottom section line up to that. So what I'm going to do is, again, put a crease in the center of this. This is kind of like what I taught when you're adding borders onto your quilt. You want to make sure that you're squaring up and keeping everything square. So I'm going to pin, let me grab, I guess all the pins I have are just these right here, but I guess they'll work. I am going to pin this 12.5-inch strip on the outside edges, first of all. And then I am going to pin this center crease to the center crease that's in that strip. And then what you'll notice is that the block itself is a little bigger. And what I'm going to do then when I sew this is I'm going to make sure that the block is up against the feed dogs, and then the sewing machine and the feed dogs will distribute everything between this pin and this pin evenly, and it will distribute everything between this pin and this pin evenly so that our block remains square. What has happened here is that there is a lot of bias right in this area, and when you press that, it does add a little bit of width in there. So it's important that you square this block up so that it squares up to this 12.5-inch strip. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and sew this. And when I sew it, I'm going to make sure that the block itself is up against the feed dogs, and I'll be looking at the bottom of this strip as I sew. Let me do this, and I'll be right back here. All right, so I have this one done, and it's just worked out beautifully. So this strip is exactly 12.5 inches, and although the pieces here, these two sections, were a little bit wider down at this end where all this bias is, because I pinned the strip here, and then in the very center, as I sewed it, it distributed all of the excess evenly between these two. And then I pressed it open, and it's just nice and square. It lays nice and flat. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I am going to pin these to each side. I'm going to find the center of here to match it up with the center behind. And then when I sew this, I am again going to make sure that that part, that the block itself that's a little bit wider, is up against the feed dogs, because the feed dogs will help to square it up and distribute all of the excess evenly between the two pins. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll bring it right back to the tabletop here. I have a video that I'm going to link below on how to avoid wavy seams, in borders, and you can do the same thing. It's the same concept in making the block. So I'm going to link that video below, and you can watch through that and see exactly how I'm using the same concept as I put borders all the way around my quilts. You can use that for making blocks, etc. But the goal is to keep each and every block as well as your entire quilt square as possible. So I've got two of these crossing the lines blocks completely finished, And again, I've pressed, in the case of these 2 blocks, I have pressed all the seams toward the dark, which happen to be the strips themselves. So everything is pressed toward the dark, and they have been squared up to 12.5 inches. So you can use this block in your Scrappy sampler quilt if you'd like, or you can simply use up a lot of your stash making these wonderfully scrappy blocks. And they go together beautifully like this, or you could actually add strips if you wanted to, and strip them all out with sashings. Whatever you choose to do, take a look at what you have in your scrap stash and then have fun with it, and use up your scrap stash. The goal is to use our scraps. That's the purpose of my presenting these blocks to you each week, so that you can understand how easy it is to actually use up your scrappy squares that you have to make beautiful quilts. So I just want to thank you so much for joining me today for week 28 of my Scrappy Block series. If you like my content that I provide, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and share my videos with your friends, with your quilt guild, so they're familiar with what I have to offer. I really do enjoy being able to present all of this to you each week. I love everything quilting, and I love to be able to share it with quilters. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to make a comment below. We'd love to hear from you, love to chat with you. You can also ask personal questions that you might not want in the comments of the YouTube channel. You can put those out on my website, and my website is quiltingwithlori.com, and there's a section on the toolbar there where you can go under contact and just get in touch with me that way. Love to hear from you. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. I'd love to see photos of all of the quilts that you're making with your scrap stash. So please also go out to my Facebook page, Quilting with Lori, and then go to my group, Scrap Up Your Stash, and join that group and start posting blocks and photos of quilts that you're making. We all love to share and inspire others with the quilts that we're working on. So I hope that you'll do that. So anyway, have a great day. Happy quilting. I've got some more fun projects coming up for you later on this week. So we'll see you in a few days. Happy quilting.